For years, my parents have been telling me about a crazy bus accident that happened near our house many years ago. One morning, a few days before I was born, my mother was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard a terrible noise. It was a series of high-pitched screams, then the screeching of tires, followed by a terrible crash. All the people in the neighborhood ran out of their homes to see what was going on. At the bottom, at the foot of the old carriage road, they found black tire tracks leading to the nearest cliff. Running to the edge of the cliff, they saw the wreckage of the bus below. Obviously, he drove straight off the cliff and crashed on the sharp rocks at the foot. People ran to where the smoking wreckage lay, trying to help the survivors. They were horrified when they found out that it was a local school bus, and all the passengers on board were their own children. The bodies of dead children lay entangled in twisted metal. Some were thrown from the bus as it fell, and their bodies smashed against the rocks, killing them in the collision. Others were decapitated by shards of glass and metal inside the bus. Parents screamed and cried when they found the mangled remains of their sons and daughters among the charred wreckage. When the ambulance and firefighters arrived, they found no survivors. All the children on the bus were killed in the accident. It was the worst disaster this area has ever experienced. In one terrible moment, an entire generation was destroyed. The parents of the dead children were inconsolable. A few days later, a grand funeral was arranged for all the dead children. People came from all over the neighborhood to pay their respects and share their grief. Almost every family in the area has lost a child in an accident. Some even lost 2 or 3. On this day, almost 40 small coffins were lowered into the ground. Soon after, an investigation was conducted, and the police got to the bottom of what happened and finally determined who was to blame for what happened. Apparently, a mentally ill man escaped from a local lunatic asylum the night before. He broke into the bus station and stole the driver's uniform. That night he lay in wait until the doors of the bus station were unlocked. Then he sneaked onto the school bus and drove out of the gate without warning anyone. That morning, he rode the school bus around the neighborhood, picking up unsuspecting children who were waiting on the side of the road on their way to school. He was wearing a bus driver's uniform, so no one suspected anything. After he gathered all the children on the route, the mentally ill man pressed the accelerator and drove off the cliff at high speed. People in our neighborhood will never forget the terrible accident caused by an escaped mental patient. When I was growing up, I didn't have many other kids to play with. Most died in a crazy bus crash. Only those children who were too young to go to school at that time survived. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was 13 years old. My parents allowed me to go to the cinema in the city theater. I met a bunch of friends there, and we had a great time watching the movie. Then we lost track of time, and it was already very late when we decided to return home. I must have waited at the bus stop for half an hour before I realized I was late for the last bus. Cursing myself for being careless, I wondered how I could get home. It wasn't that far to go, maybe a mile or 2. But at night the roads were dangerous because there were no street lights in our neighborhood to light the way. Many people were hit by cars while walking in the dark. I found a payphone and called home. Mom answered, and I told her that I missed the last bus home. She started to panic, telling me that my father was not at home and he took the car with him. She won't be able to pick me up. I told her I would just walk home, but she begged me not to, saying the roads were too dangerous at this time of night. Worse, it was starting to snow, which meant that even if the car spotted me in the dark, it probably wouldn't have time to slow down before crashing into me. She said she would try to contact our neighbors and see if they could come to town to pick me up. After hanging up, I began to lose patience. In the end, I decided that the only thing I could do was go home alone, so I set off and hoped for the best. I was walking along a deserted country road in total darkness, trying not to trip over a pothole or fall into a ditch, when I saw the headlights coming up from behind the hill behind me. Whether it was a car or a bus, but it was approaching very quickly and completely silently on a snowy road. As he approached, I could make out the outline of the car. It was a bus, and I only hoped that the driver would see me in the dark and stop. He appeared around a bend in the road and illuminated me with a bright white light. The headlights flashed in the darkness like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped to the side of the road and waved, but the bus sped past me at full speed, and for a moment I was afraid that I had missed it. But then I heard the screeching of brakes, and the bus stopped right in front of me. I ran as fast as I could and reached her just as the door swung open. As soon as I entered, the door slammed behind me and the driver took off again at full speed. It was dark on the bus, but when my eyes began to adjust, I saw that it was almost full, despite the fact that it was late at night. I found an empty seat and sat down, relaxing my tired legs. The atmosphere in the carriage seemed cold. It was colder here than outside, and there was a strange and unpleasant smell. I looked around at the other passengers. They were all silent. They didn't seem to be asleep, but they were looking straight ahead. The dead silence was alarming, and the smell quickly became unbearable. I felt too sick to say anything. The icy cold inside the bus chilled me to the bone, and the strange smell made me sick. Shaking from head to toe, I turned to the boy sitting next to me and asked if I could open the window. He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. I repeated the question even louder, but I didn't get an answer. When I couldn't stand the stench anymore, I reached out and tried to open the window myself, but the latch broke in my hand. That's when I realized that the window was covered with cobwebs and mold. In fact, every part of the bus seemed to be in terrible condition. Almost decomposition. The leather seats were covered with a crust of mold, and the floor literally rotted and broke under my feet. I turned back to the boy next to me and asked, "What happened to this bus?" Without saying a word, he slowly turned his head and looked into my face. I'll never forget that look in my life. My heart turned cold and all the blood drained from my face. His wide-open eyes seemed to pop out of their sockets. His face was pale and leathery, like a dead man's. His bloodless lips stretched out, revealing large yellow teeth. The words I was about to say froze on my lips, and a terrible feeling of horror seized me. I felt that everyone on the bus was looking right at me with the same terrible expression on their faces. Their horrible faces were covered with rotting flesh, and their clothes were covered with dirt. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were alive, and all those eyes looked at me menacingly. A cry of horror escaped my lips as I ran down the aisle, threw myself at the door and tried to open it. At that one moment, when the bus door opened, I heard a loud crash, and the bus rocked back and forth like a ship in a storm at sea. Then I heard a lot of voices, children's voices, all screaming in unison, and I felt a crushing pain before everything turned black. When I woke up and found my mother standing by my bed, it seemed to me that I had not been able to recover for several days. She told me that I had fallen off a cliff near the old carriage road. The only reason I wasn't killed was because I landed on a deep snowdrift that had accumulated on the rocks below. At dawn, a local farmer found me and took me to the nearest hospital. The surgeon found me in a state of delirium, with 2 broken legs, a broken arm and a deep cut on my forehead. Mom told me that I fell in the same place where a terrible accident with a school bus happened 13 years ago. Now you can believe whatever you want. Some people may call me a liar and others may just call me crazy, but I know that 13 years ago, a few days before I was born, I was a passenger in that crazy bus crash.